The lantern threw its light in a small, trembling circle, and inside that circle a woman knelt in the dirt with her hands full of 100 years of silence. She had been digging since noon. Her palms were raw beneath her gloves, her knees soaked through from kneeling in the wet clay that always pooled at the base of these hills once the fog came down in earnest. Above her, the collapsed stones of an old well lay scattered like broken teeth, pried loose one by one, and stacked in a ring around the hole she had made. And there, in the settling dust, half buried beneath a shelf of packed earth that had not seen daylight since before her grandfather was born, something metal caught the lantern's glow and held it. A box, lead-lined, corners soldered thick, the kind of thing built by a man who did not trust banks, or paper, or the people who might come looking for either. She did not touch it yet. Behind her, the horse stood exactly where she had left him, ears pinned forward, nostrils working the cold night air. He had refused this ground twice already, once at dusk, once again an hour later when she had tried leading him past on foot, and she had learned, over 10 patient years beside him, that an old horse's fear was rarely about nothing. She would remember this moment for the rest of her life, though she did not know that yet, kneeling there with dirt under her fingernails and her breath fogging in the October air. She only knew that 11 acres of rock and scrub oak, the land her brother had called a goat trail and laughed about in a lawyer's office 3 weeks before, had just split open at her feet like something ripening. They had given her this hillside because they believed it was worthless. They had said as much, plainly, cruelly, in front of a man in a gray suit who read her grandfather's will off a page, while she sat with her hands folded and her face very still. They had taken the vines, the equipment, the tasting room with its view of the valley, and left her the one horse too old to sell and the one parcel too rocky to farm, and they had believed, in the smug, settled way of people who have never once had to dig for anything, that the story ended there. It did not end there. It had, in fact, barely begun, though she would not understand the full shape of it, not the water, not the century-old dispute, not the words her grandfather had folded and hidden and waited 84 years to say to her, until she pried the lid from that box and let the lantern light fall, at last, on what was inside. For now she only knelt and listened to the horse breathing behind her, and reached out one gloved hand toward the lid. But to understand why her hands trembled over that lid, it is necessary to go back, not far, only weeks, to the morning the old man died. He went in early autumn, on a Tuesday, when the fog still sat low in the valley and the leaves on the old Zinfandel block had just begun to turn the color of rust. He died in his sleep, in the same iron bed he had slept in for 60 years, in the same room that smelled of pipe tobacco and liniment, and the faint sweetness of drying grapes carried up through an open window. She found him at 6, when she came in with his coffee the way she had every morning for 10 years, and she knew before she touched his hand that the house had changed shape around her. The vineyard went quiet in a way that felt almost respectful. The crews did not run the tractors that day. The dogs did not bark. Even the crows, which normally worked the rows at dawn, seemed to have gone somewhere else to wait. She sat with him for an hour before she called anyone, because she wanted, selfishly, one more hour of a world in which he was only sleeping. For 10 years, she had been the one who woke before the light to walk the rows with him, who learned to read the soil by color and the vines by the particular way they held their leaves in drought. She had missed weddings and holidays and the ordinary comforts of a life lived elsewhere, staying instead in the caretaker's cottage with its crooked door, because someone had to be there when the frost came, when the pumps failed, when he grew too unsteady to climb the terraces alone. He had taught her to prune with a blade instead of shears, to taste a berry and know, before the lab ever confirmed it, whether the sugars were ready. He had called her, more than once, the only Marchetti who still had dirt under her nails, and meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. Her brother had gone to San Francisco a decade before, into towers of glass and other people's money, and returned only for holidays, dressed in the low, expensive colors of a man who wanted to look as though he had never touched soil in his life. Her sister had gone to Los Angeles, into rooms full of screens and slogans, and spoke of the Vineyard, when she spoke of it at all, the way one speaks of a childhood home one has outgrown, fondly, distantly, as scenery rather than as a place with weight. They came back for the funeral in dark, tailored coats, embraced her stiffly at the graveside, and told her, more than once, how good it was that someone had been able to stay. They did not ask what staying had cost her. They had already, by then, begun quietly discussing what the land was worth. The morning of the funeral, rain came sideways off the ridge, threading through the rows in gray sheets that bent the grape leaves flat against their wires. She stood at the edge of the small stone chapel that his own father had built into the hillside, and she noticed, the way one notices useless things at the worst moments, that the rain smelled faintly of crushed fruit, the last of the season's fallen berries turning soft and dark beneath the vines, releasing that sweet, rotting perfume into the wet air. It mixed with the wax of the candles inside, and with the incense the old priest from Sonoma always used, and she thought she would carry that smell for the rest of her life without ever being able to explain to anyone what it meant. Her hands, chapped and scarred along the knuckles from 10 winters of pruning wire and frost-bitten mornings, would not stop shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs during the eulogy, and still they trembled, and she did not try to hide it. Grief, for her, was not something to be composed. It came up out of her the way water comes up out of broken ground, without permission, without shape. Her brother sat 2 rows ahead in a charcoal wool coat that had never seen a vineyard in its life, his jaw set at an angle that looked, in the gray chapel light, almost dignified, until she noticed his eyes were dry, and that he checked his phone once, briefly, cupped low against his knee, before the priest had even finished the first reading. Her sister wept, but prettily, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a folded handkerchief in a way that left no mark on her makeup, and Isabel understood, with a small, cold clarity she would later be ashamed of, that some part of her sister was already imagining how this would look later, retold at a dinner party, softened into an anecdote about loss and inheritance and how hard it all was. No one asked her to speak first. She stood anyway, when the silence stretched too long, and said only that he had taught her to taste a grape and know its whole future in her mouth, the sugar, the acid, the weeks still needed, and that everything else she knew about patience she had learned standing beside him in mud up to her ankles. Her brother's mouth tightened, faintly, as though she had said something indulgent. Her sister reached over and squeezed her hand once, briefly, a gesture meant to be seen more than felt. Afterward, under a dripping eave, her brother mentioned, almost in passing, that he had already called a man he knew about vineyard valuations. Her sister nodded, checking her watch, calculating. Isabel understood then, not the hour of her grief, but the hour of her flight home. The rain had not let up by the time the cars pulled away from the cemetery, and Isabel stood a long while watching the taillights dissolve into the gray, thinking of all the years those same 2 had arrived on holidays with wine gifted from other people's vineyards, never quite noticing the irony. Her brother's absence had a shape to it, specific and dated, 11 years since he'd left for San Francisco with a business degree and a hunger for something the hills could not give him fast enough. He built his fortune in glass towers and leveraged deals, buying and flipping half-built condominiums before the concrete had cured, and when he called the ranch, twice a year, dutifully, at Christmas and on the old man's birthday, he spoke to Isabel the way a man speaks to a caretaker he pays, though he had never once written a check. Her sister's absence wore different clothes. She had gone to Los Angeles for a marketing job that became a marketing career, then a title, then a corner office with a view of nothing in particular, and she spoke of the Vineyard now the way she spoke of her childhood bedroom, fondly, distantly, as a place that had shaped her personality rather than her hands. Isabel's hands were the difference. She thought of them now, chapped and split at the knuckle, and remembered other Novembers, other rains, her grandfather kneeling in the mud beside her, no older than 7, guiding her small fingers along a cane of last year's growth. "Cut here, not there," he'd said, his accent thick around the vowels. "See how it wants to go, and don't let it." He had taught her to press a palmful of soil to her nose and name what was missing: iron or moisture, or the sourness of too much clay, long before she understood that this was a kind of literacy most people never learned. He taught her to prune in the cold months when her siblings were inside by the fire, and to walk the rows at dawn checking for mildew when they were still asleep, and though he never said it aloud, not once in 10 years, she had come to believe that this was its own language of love, repetitive, physical, and entirely without applause. She remembered, too, the summer she was 12, her brother home briefly from some internship, watching her graft a cutting with visible impatience, as though her care were a kind of embarrassment. "That's not how you make money," he'd said, not unkindly, just factually, the way he said most things. Her grandfather had only smiled and told her to keep working. Somewhere behind that smile she understood now, standing wet and orphaned of nearly everyone who mattered, there had been a decision quietly forming, one that would not be spoken aloud for years, one that no rain, no eulogy, no calculating glance at a watch could touch. The office where the family's affairs had been settled for 3 generations sat above a hardware store on the town square, its windows fogged now with the first real cold of November, and she arrived early, as she arrived early to everything, and sat alone in the waiting room, breathing in the smell of paper and old radiator heat. The walls were paneled in a dark walnut that had absorbed decades of cigar smoke before the ban, decades of handshakes and signatures, and the quiet arithmetic of families deciding what they owed one another. A framed photograph of the town in 1948 hung crooked by the door. No one had straightened it in years. The lawyer who emerged to greet her had known her grandfather since before she was born, a heavy-set man in his 70s with reading glasses pushed up into thinning hair, his tie a shade of green, that had gone out of fashion decades earlier and would likely outlive him. He shook her hand with both of his, held it a moment longer than necessary, and said nothing about the will, only asked after Rosalind, and whether the vines had been covered before the frost. It was the kind of question a man asks when he already knows the answers to the larger ones, and has run out of comfortable things to say about them. Her brother arrived 20 minutes later in a charcoal overcoat that had never seen a vineyard row, trailing the particular energy of someone who had rearranged an important morning to be there and wanted it noted. Her sister came last, apologizing for traffic from the airport, her sunglasses pushed up into hair that had been cut in Los Angeles 2 days prior at considerable expense. They embraced Isabel briefly, the way people embrace at funerals when there is an audience, and took the 2 chairs nearest the lawyer's desk without discussion of who deserved them. The office itself was small for what it was about to hold. 4 chairs, a heavy oak desk scarred at the corners, a single window looking out over the square where a delivery truck idled with its hazards blinking. The lawyer settled behind stacks of manila folders bound in twine, each one labeled in a spidery hand that Isabel recognized as belonging to a different decade of his career. He cleared his throat twice before he began, the sound of a man who had delivered good news and bad news from behind that same desk more times than he cared to count, and who had, perhaps, some private sense of which kind this would be. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift off the square, and somewhere down the street a church bell marked the hour, and Isabel folded her hands in her lap the way her grandfather used to before difficult conversations, and waited. The lawyer opened the first folder with the care of a man handling something that might still bite him, and began to read in the flat cadence reserved for documents that no longer belonged to conversation but to record. "I, Salvatore Domenico Marchetti, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills and codicils." The language moved the way legal language always moves, indifferent to the temperature of the room it is spoken into, and Isabel found herself listening not to the words themselves but to the rhythm beneath them, the way she used to listen for her grandfather's breathing through the cottage wall in his last winter, checking that it continued. It continued for some time, bequests of small furniture, a set of tools, a modest sum to the church in town, before the lawyer arrived at the section concerning Marchetti Vineyards proper, and here his voice slowed, as if he were laying each sentence down, like a stone he did not entirely trust to hold weight. The Vineyard's operating shares, he read, together with all associated voting rights over sale, lease, or transfer of the property, were to be divided equally between the two named heirs, the brother and the sister, jointly and in full, effective upon probate. Isabel heard the words land and did not, at first, understand them as they applied to her, the way a person standing in a field does not immediately understand that the sound approaching is thunder rather than a passing truck. She had assumed, had allowed herself in the quiet arithmetic of 10 years to assume that labor accrued into something like ownership, that the version of the vineyard she had kept breathing through drought and frost and her grandfather's failing hands would be recognized in some legal fraction of itself. But the document did not measure hands. It measured names on paper drawn up decades earlier, before she had learned to prune a cane or read a soil sample, and those names were not hers. She sat very still. Beside her she was aware of her brother uncrossing his legs, a small, satisfied adjustment, the posture of a man confirming an outcome he had already privately calculated. Her sister said nothing, but her eyes moved once toward Isabel and then away, quick and almost apologetic, before settling back on the lawyer with practiced attention. The remaining provisions, the lawyer continued, and cleared his throat a third time, concern the disposition of certain personal and real property to the decedent's granddaughter, Isabel. The church bell outside finished its count. The fog had not yet fully lifted. Isabel unfolded her hands, then folded them again, and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives just before a wound begins to hurt, that whatever came next in that folder would not undo what had already been decided in the sentence before it. The lawyer read on, but the room had already stopped listening to him. Her brother leaned forward, elbows on knees, the posture of a man who had rehearsed this moment in the mirror of some glass-walled office, overlooking a bay he'd never once brought their grandfather to see. "Before we get to hobby projects," he said, "I think we should discuss Halstead." The name landed like a dropped glass. The lawyer paused, glasses lowering fractionally, and her brother continued as though he had been granted the floor rather than seized it. Halstead Group, he explained, had already toured the property, twice. Their acquisitions director had walked the rows in April, again in July, had taken soil samples without asking, and left orange flags along the eastern fence like a man marking territory he already believed was his. A conditional agreement existed. Numbers existed. He recited a figure that made the room's temperature seem to drop, and Isabel understood, watching his mouth shape the number with something close to pleasure, that this had never truly been a will reading. It had been a formality standing between him and a wire transfer. 10 years of pruning and hauling irrigation line isn't a business, he said, not quite looking at her. It's hobby work. Charming, I'm sure, but Halstead doesn't buy charming. Her sister exhaled through her nose, the particular sound of someone whose patience was a scheduled resource. And frankly, she said, even setting the money aside, do you know what it costs me to fly up here every time something needs a signature? I have a launch in November. I can't keep explaining to clients why I'm standing in a vineyard instead of in a boardroom, she said. Vineyard. The way one might say. Inconvenience. Folding it neatly into her complaint, as if the land itself had been designed to embarrass her. Isabel said nothing. She had learned, across a decade of harvests and broken pumps and 4 a.m. frost alarms, that silence cost her less than defending herself to people who had already decided what she was. The lawyer, to his credit, tried once to redirect them toward the document in his hands, toward the actual language of provisions and parcels, but her brother waved a hand, an old gesture, one she remembered from childhood arguments over the last seat in the truck, and said, Just read her part. We all know where this is going. Outside, the fog had begun, finally, to burn off the ridge, revealing the pale outline of hills her grandfather used to name like old friends. Isabel watched that light through the window instead of the faces around her, and thought, with a strange, aching steadiness, that whatever waited in the folder could not be worse than watching her siblings speak of 40 years of family labor as though it were an expense line to be closed out. The lawyer cleared his throat once more and turned the page. To Isabel Marchetti, he read, and something in the room seemed to still, the way air stills before a change in weather. I bequeath the mare Rosalind, in recognition of her care for the animal these 10 years past, and the northern hillside parcel of approximately 11 acres, bounded by the old stone wall and the dry creek, together with all rights and appurtenances thereto, excluding those already conveyed under the primary sale agreement. He set the page down. For a moment no one spoke, and Isabel felt the old, familiar reflex rise in her, the instinct to be grateful for whatever scraps were offered, to say thank you, before she had even understood what she was thanking anyone for. She did not let herself speak it. She only looked at the lawyer's hands, steady on the desk, and waited for the rest, though some quiet animal part of her already understood there would be no rest, that this was the whole of it, 11 acres of rock and scrub, and a horse too old to sell. Her brother was the first to laugh, a short, incredulous sound, more breath than mirth. "The goat trail," he said, to no one in particular, and then, turning to her with an expression she recognized from 100 childhood disputes settled always in his favor. "Enjoy the goat trail, Isabel. It's all yours." Her sister's laugh followed a half-second behind his, brighter, crueler for its lightness. "Honestly," she said, tapping a manicured nail against the arm of her chair, "it's almost sweet. Grandpa's idea of a joke. She said it the way one might describe a child's drawing, fond and dismissive in the same breath, already reaching for her phone, as though the matter had concluded itself." Isabel did not answer them. She was looking instead at the words on the page as the lawyer turned it toward her, the old surveyor's language, bounded by the stone wall and the dry creek, and she was thinking, absurdly, of the mare standing in the cold paddock behind the main house, the one who had let her sleep against her flank during the worst of the frost seasons, breath rising between them like smoke. Rosalind, at least, had never once looked at her the way her siblings did now, as though she were a problem that had, at last, been solved cheaply. The lawyer cleared his throat, folded his hands, and said, with the particular gentleness of a man who had delivered worse news in that same office, that the sale of the primary acreage to Kestrel Point Vineyard Holdings was set to close within 90 days, contingent on final title review. Her brother nodded, as though this were the only part of the reading that had mattered. Her sister was already standing, smoothing her coat, speaking of a flight she needed to catch. Isabel folded her hands in her lap and said nothing at all, though outside the window the fog had lifted fully now, and the hills stood bare and pale and waiting, as if they, too, were listening for what she would do next. She did not cry. That was the thing she would remember later, when she tried to reconstruct the shape of that hour, that she had sat in the leather chair with her hands folded like a schoolgirl waiting to be dismissed, and no tears had come, though something in her chest had gone very still and very cold, the way the creek went still under the first hard frost, ice forming not from the surface down but from some deeper place first. She thought of the hillside, not as the lawyer had described it, 11 acres of scrub and stone, unfarmable, worthless, the sort of parcel a man mentions only because the law requires him to account for every foot of ground, but as she had known it as a girl of 12, walking behind her grandfather with a canteen sloshing against her hip while he pointed out where the old mission vines still clung to the terraces his own grandfather had cut into the rock by hand. He used to stop there, always at the same flat stone near the crest, and say nothing for a long while, just look out at the valley the way other men looked at photographs of the dead. She had not understood it then. She had thought it was only tiredness, or nostalgia, or the particular silence old men fall into near the end of a working day. Now she understood it was something closer to reverence. Her brother was already discussing logistics with the lawyer in the low, efficient tone he used for closings, dates, disbursements, the transfer of the tasting room inventory, as though the vineyard were a spreadsheet that had finally balanced. Her sister stood by the window checking her phone, her coat already buttoned against a chill that did not yet exist indoors. Neither of them looked at her. She understood that this, too, was a kind of mercy on their part, though they would not have called it that. It was easier for them not to see what was in her face. She thought, I will not give them the satisfaction of a scene. She thought, he wanted me to have that hillside for a reason, even if the reason was only that he loved me and had nothing else left to give. And beneath both of those thoughts, quiet and unhurried, something else was already forming. Not a plan, not yet, only an intention, the kind that takes root before the mind has agreed to it, before the sale closed. Before the surveyors came with their orange flags and their indifferent boots, she would ride the boundary line herself, the whole of it, the way her grandfather had taught her to ride a fence line as a girl, slowly, attentively, looking not at the view but at the ground. She said none of this aloud. She rose when it was time to rise, shook the lawyer's hand, and walked out past her siblings into a cold that smelled, faintly and stubbornly, of wood smoke and wet stone. The caretaker's cottage had not been slept in for 11 years, not since the last of the seasonal crew had moved on to steadier work, and it smelled of mothballs and mouse nest and the particular dust that settles in a room no one loves. She swept it herself, on the first night, by lantern light, because the wiring had not been checked in a decade, and she did not trust it yet. She found a cot frame in the shed and a mattress in the loft that the damp had not entirely ruined, and she slept under 2 wool blankets that had belonged, she was almost certain, to her grandfather's own father, the pattern faded to the color of weak tea. By day she made herself useful in town, because the vineyard's accounts were no longer hers to draw from, and had not been, in truth, since the reading of the will. She shod horses for the Ostrander Ranch on Petrified Forest Road, her hands remembering the work before her mind had fully agreed to do it again. She recaned chair seats for a woman in Glen Ellen who paid her in cash and in stew. She repointed a stone wall for a retired judge who asked no questions and tipped generously, and she was grateful, in a way that had nothing to do with the money, simply to be trusted with something that needed doing carefully. And always, in the gaps between these small labors, she watched. She watched the appraisers come with their clipboards and their soft-soled shoes, walking the rows she had pruned herself for 10 Novembers, speaking to one another in the flattened vocabulary of acreage and yield projections, as though the vines were a spreadsheet that had briefly, regrettably, taken root in soil. She watched the surveyors plant their orange flags along the southern boundary, then the eastern, working with the unhurried confidence of men who believed the ground had already agreed to whatever was coming. None of them walked the hillside. She noticed that. None of them so much as glanced toward the collapsed stones near the old mission grove, because the hillside was not, in the language of the purchase agreement, worth the time it would take to climb it. She noticed, too, that Rosalind had grown restless in the paddock, pacing the fence line in the mornings, as though waiting to be asked for something. She did not go to her siblings' calls. Her brother left 2 messages, brisk and businesslike, about signing forms before the closing date. Her sister left one, shorter still, that ended, almost as an afterthought, with, "I hope you're doing all right out there," a sentence Isabel turned over for a long time, trying to decide whether it was kindness or only manners, and deciding, finally, that it did not matter which. What mattered was the boundary line, uncomputed and unflagged, and the ride she had promised herself she would take before the surveyor's orange flags reached it first. The cottage kept its own hours now. She woke before the light out of habit rather than necessity, made coffee in the same dented percolator her grandfather had used for 60 years, and ate her toast standing at the window, watching the fog lift off vines that would, in a matter of weeks, belong to strangers. The silence did not used to feel like this. When he was alive, silence had been a kind of company, the particular quiet of two people who did not need to speak to work well together, passing tools back and forth in the equipment shed, correcting each other with a look rather than a word. Now the quiet had nothing underneath it. It was only quiet. She took her dinners at the same small table, usually something simple: eggs, a heel of bread, whatever the caretaker's cottage pantry allowed, and she found she had begun talking to the dog that was not there, then catching herself, and laughing once, without much humor in it, at the sound of her own voice filling a room built for two. The regional acquisitions director came twice that November, a man in his 40s with an unhurried gait and shoes too clean for the ground he walked on. He carried a tablet instead of a notebook and photographed the rows in efficient, sweeping arcs, the way a man photographs a thing he has already decided he owns. He was not unkind to her, exactly. He nodded when they passed near the crush pad, said good morning with a professional warmth that cost him nothing, and once remarked, gesturing at the old stone farmhouse, that they'd likely restore it for the tasting room experience. Very rustic, very authentic. She had said nothing. She had only watched him walk the gravel path her grandfather had laid himself, one wheelbarrow load at a time, the autumn she turned 19. Her brother's calls arrived like invoices, dated, itemized, devoid of anything that might be mistaken for feeling. Sign here, initial there, a follow-up email this time to confirm receipt. Her sister's texts grew shorter still, reduced at last to a single thumbs up beneath a forwarded document, as if the closing were a wedding they were both too busy to properly attend. Isabel began to notice the small tally she was keeping without meaning to, the number of days since anyone had asked her a question that wasn't about paperwork, the number of mornings she'd eaten alone at that table, the number of times she'd caught herself glancing toward the phone and then deciding against it. She was not accustomed to loneliness. She had always thought of solitude as something chosen, something with dignity in it. This was different. This was the particular ache of being present at the end of something everyone else had already left. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and went out to the paddock, where Rosalind stood watching her with the patient, unblinking attention of an animal that understood, in her own way, exactly what was coming. The mare's breath fogged in the cold, and Isabel pressed her forehead briefly to the warm plane of her neck before turning back toward the cottage, where the last of the boxes still waited to be sorted for the estate inventory. It was in the third box, beneath a stack of ledgers gone soft at the corners, beneath a rosary she didn't remember him keeping, that she found the photograph. It had curled with age, the color gone amber, the kind of amber that only happens to film left too long in a drawer near a window. In it, she was perhaps 7, perched in front of him on a horse she did not recognize, some earlier animal, long dead now, its coat a darker bay than Rosalind's. Her grandfather's hat was pushed back on his head. Behind them rose the hillside, unmistakable even now, that particular fold of land where the oaks grew crooked, and the rock broke the surface of the soil like something trying to remember its shape. She sat with it a long time. She did not recall the ride itself. She recalled, instead, the feeling of it. His arm braced across her middle, the smell of tobacco and horse sweat, his voice low and unhurried, narrating boundaries she'd had no reason yet to care about. That's where the line runs, up past the old well. Your great-great-grandfather dug that well by hand. Don't let anyone tell you that ground isn't worth anything. She had been 7. She had not known to write it down. She turned the photograph over. No date, no inscription. Only, in pencil gone nearly invisible, a single word. Hers. Isabel set the photograph on the kitchen table, propped against the sugar bowl, and looked at it the way one looks at a door left slightly open. The buyer's people had scheduled the final survey walk for the following week, a formality before the papers closed, and no one had asked her to be present for it. No one had asked her much of anything since the reading. But the boundary lines on that hillside were hers to check, whatever her brother's tone had implied when he'd handed them to her like a consolation prize, and she found, standing there in the kitchen with the coffee going cold again, that she needed, to see that ground herself before it passed forever out of the family's hands, before it became a line item in someone else's portfolio. She went out to the paddock in the gray hour before full light, when the fog still sat low over the vine rows, and set the old saddle on Rosalind's back with hands that had done it 1,000 times and still felt, that morning, as though they were doing it for the first time. The mare turned her head, ears forward, watching her with that same patient attention, as if she too understood there was somewhere they were meant to go. The gate at the paddock's edge still stuck the way it always had, warped by 20 winters of rain, and she lifted it free of its rut with the heel of her boot before leading the mare through. Outside, the world was the color of pewter. The dry grass along the lower trail had gone the pale gold it turned every November, brittle enough to hear underfoot even through the padding of hooves, and the air carried that particular late autumn smell she had never found a name for, dust and cold and something faintly sweet, like the last exhale of the harvest just past. She swung up into the saddle and let the mare choose the pace, and for a while neither of them hurried. She had not ridden this far north in years, not since she was a girl, really, small enough that the hillside had seemed enormous, a place of goat trails and blackberry thickets, where her grandfather used to say the old vines still remembered things the new ones didn't. The main rows fell away behind her as they climbed, the neat green geometry of the valley floor giving way to scrub oak and gray stone and the kind of tangled, uncultivated ground that no consultant would ever put a price on. Fog sat in the low folds between the hills, thick as milk in the hollows and thinning where the land rose, so that for a moment she seemed to be riding into and out of it at once, the trail ahead disappearing and reappearing, like something remembered rather than seen. Rosalind's gait was unhurried, familiar, the same rolling walk Isabel had known since she was 9 years old and too short to reach the stirrups without help. There was a comfort in it that she hadn't expected, in the creak of the leather, the warmth coming up through the saddle, the small huffing breaths the mare made climbing the steeper switchbacks. It was the closest she had felt in weeks to something like peace. She noticed the old fence posts, gray and leaning, that marked out sections of the boundary no one had walked in a decade. She noticed a hawk circling low over the dry wash to the east. She noticed, too, how much of this ground she had never actually seen. Not really, not with her own eyes, because it had always been the part of the vineyard nobody bothered with, the part her grandfather had walked alone some mornings while she was down among the rows he actually farmed. She hadn't asked him, back then, what he did up here, or why. It hadn't occurred to her that there was anything to ask. The trail bent westward past a stand of old oaks she remembered climbing as a child, and beyond them, half hidden by scrub and years of neglect, the ground began to fall away toward a shallow draw she did not recognize at all. She let the mare pick her own pace down into the draw, the reins slack against the pommel, and it was there, past a tangle of dead blackberry cane and a cluster of untrimmed mission vines gone half feral with age, that she felt the gelding's gait change beneath her. Not a stumble, not a shy at some blowing paper or startled quail, but a full and deliberate stop, 4 hooves planted, ears pinned flat and swiveling. "Easy," she said, more out of habit than expectation, and touched her heel to the mare's flank. Rosalind did not move. She had ridden this horse for 10 years. She knew the difference between a mare who was tired and a mare who was frightened, and she knew, too, the particular stillness that came over an animal when it had decided, on instinct alone, that a thing ahead of it could not be trusted. And she had learned, the hard way, in her 2nd year managing the vineyard, that dismissing that stillness cost her a sprained wrist and a torn hay tarp and a week of limping. She did not dismiss it now. She sat for a moment, studying the ground the mare refused to enter. At first she saw only what looked like a low mound of brush and fallen stone, half swallowed by a wild tangle of manzanita and dead grass gone silver with age, the kind of unremarkable rubble that dotted every neglected corner of hill country left alone long enough. But looking longer, she began to make out a shape beneath the growth. A rough circle, stones fitted close in the old style, stacked without mortar the way her great-great-grandfather's generation had built things meant to last past their own lifetimes. A well, she realized, or what had been one, before its mouth collapsed inward on itself, sometime in a past she had no memory of, and no one still living could name. She dismounted slowly, looping the reins around a low oak branch, and Rosalind exhaled hard through her nose, stamping once, watching her with an intensity that felt less like fear now than warning. "I'm only looking," she murmured, though she was no longer certain that was true. The afternoon light had gone the color of weak tea, slanting long across the draw, and standing at the edge of the collapsed stones she felt, for the first time since she had ridden out that morning, a small, cold thread of something that was not quite unease and not quite excitement, but sat uncomfortably close to both. She crouched at the rim, brushing aside a curtain of dead vine, and found that the stones nearest the surface had not simply fallen with age. They had been placed, stacked deliberately across the opening, as if someone long ago had wanted this hole in the earth closed, and had wanted it closed carefully. She sat back on her heels and looked at it a long moment before she reached for the first stone. The first stone came away easier than she expected, cool and gritty against her palms, and she set it aside in the dry grass with the care of someone handling something borrowed rather than found. Beneath it, the fit of the next stone surprised her. It was not fieldstone stacked the way the old boundary walls had been stacked, roughly, by men in a hurry to be done before winter. These stones had been dressed, squared at the edges, shaped by a hand that had taken time, that had cared how the thing looked even though it would be buried in earth where no one would ever admire the work. She ran her thumb along one seam and felt the faint ridges of a chisel, deliberate marks, nothing like the rubble walls that laced the rest of the property. She sat back again, frowning at her own hands. In 10 years of walking every acre of this land, she had never seen stonework like it. She knew the old wall by the equipment shed, knew the crumbling terrace foundations near the south block, knew even the half-collapsed spring house her grandfather used to point at and call, "Your great-great-grandfather's foolishness." Fondly, the way he spoke of anything that had outlasted its maker. This was not that. This had the patience of something meant to endure, meant to hide. She kept clearing, stone by stone, her shoulders aching in a way that felt almost pleasant, almost familiar, the ache of real work, the kind she had missed without knowing it these past months. Rosalind shifted behind her, hooves restless in the leaf litter, but did not pull against the reins, did not bolt. She only watched, ears swiveled forward, as if she too were waiting to see what the hillside would give up. Then Isabel's fingers closed on iron. She paused, brushed away the dirt with the flat of her hand, and found a ring, hand-forged, thick as her thumb, its surface pitted with a century of rust but its shape unmistakable, deliberate, wrought rather than cast. It had been set into a stone lintel that ran the width of the opening, a threshold stone, the kind used to frame a door rather than seal a well. This was not a well at all. She sat very still with that thought, the light thinning further, the oak branches throwing long broken shadows across the stones. A well did not need a lintel. A well did not need a door. She thought of every ledger she had ever helped her grandfather balance, every boundary map she had traced with him at the kitchen table by lamplight, and she could not place this structure in any of it. Not in memory, not in paper, not in the stories he had told her about the family's first years on this hillside. Whatever this was, no one living had ever spoken of it. She reached again for the iron ring and pulled. The ring did not move at first. It had fused itself to the stone with rust and a century of silence, and she had to brace her boot against the lintel and pull with both hands before it gave, all at once, with a groan that seemed to travel down into the earth rather than up out of it. Rosalind, tethered to the oak above, shifted her weight and blew a long breath through her nostrils, but did not bolt. She had stopped fighting the place. She only watched. Beneath the lintel, Where Isabel had expected packed earth or perhaps the round mouth of a true well shaft, there was instead a narrow stone stairway, cut crudely but with intention, descending at a steep pitch into the hillside. The steps were shallow, worn at their centers in a way that suggested feet had used them many times, long ago, and not carelessly. She counted 12 steps by torchlight before the beam gave out on packed dirt and the outline of something below. A door, she realized, set flush into a wall of mortared fieldstone that did not belong to any structure she had ever mapped. She went down slowly, one hand on the cold stone, testing each step before committing her weight. The air changed as she descended, losing the dry oak and dust smell of the hillside and taking on something older, mineral, faintly sulphurous, the smell of water that had not moved in a long time. At the bottom, her light found the door in full, iron, riveted in the old style, its surface scaled with rust the color of dried blood. Near its upper edge, where a hand might once have reached to knock rather than push, someone had engraved 4 numerals into the metal itself, the strokes shallow but unmistakable under a century of oxidation. 1911. She said the number aloud, once, quietly, the way she might confirm a fact she did not yet trust. The date meant nothing to her and everything at once, before her grandfather's birth, before the vineyard had taken its present shape on any deed she had ever traced, back into the years she knew only as fragments of dinner-table story. Domenico, the first Marchetti to hold this ground, a name spoken with reverence but almost no detail, a man who had apparently left behind no letters, no photographs, nothing but rootstock and a surname. She pressed her palm flat against the door's cold face and felt, beneath the rust, a seam where it had been sealed rather than simply shut, packed at its edges with something like tar, long since hardened to stone. Whoever had closed this door had not intended it to be opened again by accident, or soon, or perhaps ever. Above her, faintly, she heard Rosalind stamp once against the packed earth, a small percussive sound that carried strangely down the stone stairway, as though the hillside itself were listening. Isabel drew a breath, set her shoulder against the iron, and began, for the second time that evening, to work something loose that had been sealed for longer than anyone now living could account for. The hinge gave before the latch did, a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than metal, deeper than stone, the sound of a century exhaling. She did not so much open the door as coax it, rocking it by degrees, her boot braced against the threshold, her palms raw against the pitted iron. Dust sifted down from the lintel in a fine gray curtain, catching the last of the lantern light like something suspended in water, and then, all at once, it gave way entirely, swinging inward on a silence so complete she could hear her own pulse in her ears. The air that met her was dry. That was the first thing she registered, before her eyes had adjusted to the dark beyond the lantern's reach. Not the wet, mineral cold she had expected from a hole dug into hillside rock, but a dryness so absolute it seemed to have preserved the room whole, untouched by the 90-odd years that had passed above it. She stepped down onto a floor of packed earth and found it firm beneath her boot, unyielding, as though it had been tamped that morning rather than sometime before the First World War. She lifted the lantern. The cellar was small, no larger than the caretaker's cottage kitchen, and along its far wall ran a shelf cut directly into the stone, waist-high, still bearing the marks of whatever tool had shaped it. On that shelf sat 3 things, arranged with a care that struck her, even now, as deliberate. A row of wine bottles, 6 or 7 of them, their glass gone cloudy with a century of dust so thick it had fused into a kind of second skin, corks long since collapsed inward. Beside them, a wooden box, and this one had not fared as well. Its lid had rotted through at one corner, the wood gone soft and dark and faintly powdery where she touched it, releasing a smell like wet paper and old iron. And beside that, untouched, unmarked by any of the decay that had claimed its neighbors, sat a box of dull gray metal, its seams soldered, its surface cool and strangely heavy-looking even before she lifted it. She knew lead when she saw it. Her grandfather had kept a box like this once, smaller, in the tool shed, for blasting caps he'd never used and never explained. This one was larger, deliberate in its construction, clearly built to survive exactly what had been asked of it, a century underground, sealed behind a door packed with tar, hidden behind a well someone had gone to the trouble of collapsing. She set the lantern on the shelf beside it. Her hands, she noticed, had gone very still, the way they did before a difficult graft, when the smallest tremor could ruin the cut. Somewhere above her, Rosalind stamped again, twice this time, and did not stop. She did not open the box that night. She carried it up through the collapsed throat of the well as the light failed, wrapped it in a horse blanket in the bed of the truck, and drove back to the cottage with both hands tight on the wheel, though nothing was chasing her. It sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before she touched the seams again, and in those 2 days, she went looking instead for the story that would tell her what she was holding. The Sonoma County Recorder's Office kept its oldest volumes in a back room that smelled of dust and formaldehyde-tinged binding glue, and the clerk who found them for her, a heavy-set man with reading glasses on a chain, seemed faintly delighted that anyone still cared. She found the boundary survey from 1909, water-worn and rebound, showing the northern parcel as a disputed strip claimed by both the Marchetti family and a rancher named Elias Whitfield, whose name she recognized only vaguely from a road sign 3 miles east. The dispute, the ledger noted in a clerk's careful copperplate, concerned rights of access to the spring. Nothing more. The rest she pieced together from letters, a shoebox of them her grandfather had kept in the cottage attic, brittle onion skin pages in Domenico's cramped hand, half in Italian, half in an English he'd clearly been proud to have learned. He wrote of Whitfield's men cutting fence wire in the dark. He wrote of a lawyer in Santa Rosa who would not return his calls, of a judge who drinks with the Whitfields on Sundays. He wrote, in October of 1911, that he had made a place where no man's boot will find what is mine. Not this year, not in any year the law forgets to look. It was prohibition-adjacent paranoia layered over something older and more practical, she understood. A man who had learned, in the old country, that paper promises could be burned, and that some things had to be hidden the way you hid seed corn from an army. He had not trusted the courthouse. He had trusted stone and lead and 40 feet of hillside. She sat with the letters until the lamp burned low, understanding for the first time that the collapsed well had never been an accident of erosion. Someone, Domenico himself, most likely, in his final years, had pulled it down on purpose, sealing the door behind a wound that looked like nothing more than old rock giving way to old rain. Rosalind had known before she did. Rosalind had simply stopped where the ground remembered being disturbed. She closed the last letter, turned back to the gray box still waiting at the center of the table, and reached, this time, for the seam. The seam gave under her thumbnail with a sound like a held breath finally released, not rusted shut as she had expected, but sealed with something waxen, tallow perhaps, applied a century ago and never disturbed since. The lid lifted an inch, resisted, lifted again. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and amber with age, lay 2 rolled sheets of paper and, beneath them, a single folded document bearing a wax seal stamped with initials she did not recognize until she turned it to the lamp. A notary's mark, County of Sonoma, dated the 14th of November, 1911. She unrolled the maps first, weighting the corners with her coffee cup and the lamp's brass base. The paper was surveyor's linen, brittle at the fold lines but legible, inked in a careful, old-fashioned hand that reminded her of her grandfather's own. The same slant, she realized, the same stubborn seriousness in the loops of the letters, as though penmanship itself were a thing passed down like a deed. The map showed the vineyard's boundaries as they had been laid out before the county redrew them in the 1940s, before 3 later subdivisions folded acreage into new shapes and new names. And there, on the northern edge, unmistakably marked with a small inked spring symbol and a dotted line running downhill into what was now the main irrigation trunk, was the 11 acres her brother had called a goat trail. She sat very still. The second document was the certificate. She read it twice before she trusted herself to believe it, hand-inked, the language formal and looping, granting to Domenico Marchetti and his heirs in perpetuity the senior appropriative rights to the artesian spring rising on Parcel 4, rights that predated, by decades, any water claim later filed by the ranchers downhill or the county itself. Senior rights? She knew enough from a decade of irrigation permits and drought year arguments with the water board to understand what those two words meant. Senior rights did not share. Senior rights did not yield when the wells ran low. Senior rights sat at the top of a very long, very old line, and everyone beneath them drank only what was left over. The spring that fed this certificate was the same spring. She was certain of it, tracing the dotted line with one finger until it disappeared off the map's edge, that fed the reservoir behind the main house, the reservoir that fed every drip line and every block of vines her grandfather had spent 60 years coaxing into fruit. The vineyard her siblings were selling did not, on paper, own the water that kept it alive. She had spent an evening believing she had inherited nothing but rock and a horse who refused to walk past ghosts. She understood now, sitting alone in lamplight with linen paper trembling faintly in her hands, that she had been wrong about the size of what she'd been given. She did not sleep. She told herself later that this was not drama, only arithmetic, that a woman who has spent 10 years learning which numbers matter does not put down a document that changes all of them and simply close her eyes. By 6, she had wrapped the linen papers in a dish towel, laid them flat in the bed of the old truck as though they might bruise, and driven the 22 miles into town before the estate lawyer's secretary had unlocked the door. He received her without an appointment, which told her something about how she must have looked. He was a careful man, gray at the temples, who had drawn up 3 generations of Marchetti paperwork and did not like surprises in his own field. She watched his reading glasses go on, then his face go still, then still further, in the particular way of a man revising an opinion he had held with confidence for months. Where, he asked, did this come from? She told him. The well, the cellar, the lead box. She did not embellish, and she did not need to. He spent the better part of an hour with the maps spread across his desk, cross-referencing them against a bound copy of the county's water rights ledger, tracing parcel lines with a ruler as though skepticism itself were a kind of due diligence he owed her, or owed himself. He made 2 phone calls, both brief, both to the county recorder's office, in a tone that grew less patient with each one. When he finally sat back, he did not look at her the way he had at the will reading, when he had read the bequest aloud in the same flat voice he might have used for a parking violation. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has misjudged. These were never severed, he said. Not in your great-grandfather's deed, not in your grandfather's, not in the parcel split filed 9 years ago when the northern acreage was surveyed for the county line dispute. Whoever drew up that survey assumed the water went with the main house. It didn't. It never did. He tapped the certificate, the notary's seal still legible after a century of dark and stone. This is still good. This is still binding. He looked at the file open beside it, the conditional purchase agreement, the conglomerate's letterhead, the clause on page 4 that he himself had reviewed and initialed months earlier without ever noticing what it failed to include. The sale, he said slowly, as though testing the shape of the sentence before he trusted it, is not what your brother thinks it is. Outside, the morning traffic moved past the window in its ordinary, indifferent way. Isabel sat very still, aware of her own pulse, aware that somewhere across the bay her siblings were going about their week, believing the ground beneath them was solid. She waited 3 days before she called him, not out of hesitation but because the lawyer had counseled patience, a strange thing to hear from a man who had spent 30 years billing by the quarter hour, and stranger still that she found herself agreeing with him. Let the documents settle in his files, he said. Let him draft the letter properly, with copies to the county recorder. before anyone in San Francisco or Los Angeles caught wind of what had been found in a cellar dug by a man dead for 80 years. But the acquisitions director called first. He introduced himself the way he had at the Vineyard walkthrough months earlier, pleasant, unhurried, a voice that belonged to a man who had never once had to raise it to get what he wanted. He was following up, he said, on some paperwork discrepancies flagged by his firm's title company. Nothing urgent, a formality. Then he asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she was aware of any outstanding water rights attached to the northern parcel. She let the silence stretch a moment longer than was polite. Yes, she said. She was aware. There was a pause on his end that told her everything the lawyer's careful language had only implied. When he spoke again, the ease had gone out of his voice, replaced by something more careful, more exposed. He explained, with the reluctance of a man reading from a script he had not written, that the agreement was structured around full conveyance of irrigation infrastructure and associated rights, that without the senior water rights to the spring, the acreage as contracted was, in his words, not the asset we modeled. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The number he mentioned next, the one his firm had already committed internally, was large enough that she heard him swallow before he said it. Without the water, he told her, the deal could not close as structured, not at the agreed price, perhaps not at all. She thought of her brother's voice in the lawyer's office, easy and certain, dividing the ranch like a man portioning dessert. Enjoy the goat trail. She thought of the 11 rocky acres he had waved away without a second glance, so sure of what could and could not hold value that he had never once asked what lay beneath it. She told the acquisitions director she would need to consult her attorney before saying anything further, and that any conversation about the rights would have to include her directly, not through her siblings, not through their broker. He agreed, almost too quickly. After she hung up, she stood a long moment in the caretaker's cottage, the receiver still warm in her hand, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt since the reading of the will. Not triumph, not yet, but the quiet, unfamiliar sensation of being, for the first time in a decade, the one holding the map. They came within 2 days, which told her something about how fast the news had traveled and how little sleep either of them had gotten in between. She heard the car before she saw it, not her brother's usual leased sedan but a rental, hurried, gravel spitting under tires that didn't know the drive's ruts. Her sister was out first, blazer creased from the flight, sunglasses pushed up into hair that hadn't seen a shower. Her brother came around the other side more slowly, jaw set, the particular stillness of a man rehearsing his opening line. He didn't wait to be let in. What did you do? Not a question. She held the door and let them into the cottage's one good room, where the deed box sat open on the table, beside a chipped mug of coffee, steam still rising off it as if the morning itself were unbothered. I didn't do anything, she said. I found something. Her sister's eyes went to the papers first, quick and calculating even now, the marketing instinct reading the room before the words. Her brother's went to Isabel's face, searching for the scheme he was certain must be there. You've been sitting on this, he said. Since when? Since the funeral? Since before the vote? Since Sunday, she said. You're welcome to check the notary's date. He picked up the water rights certificate the way a man picks up something he suspects might be counterfeit, holding it slightly away from himself, and she watched the composure that had carried him through the will reading, through a decade of phone calls made from restaurants and airport lounges, begin to come apart at its seams, not loudly, but in the small failures of a face unused to failing. His mouth worked. Nothing certain came out of it. This doesn't change the vote, he finally said. The estate can't close without the water, she said. Your buyer already told you that. He told me himself, 3 days ago. She let that sit. You can keep arguing about a sale that no longer exists, or you can talk to me about one that does. Her sister sat down without being asked, which was its own kind of surrender. What do you want? She said, and there was no marketing polish left in it, only tiredness. Isabel had thought about this moment on the ride back from the well, and again through 2 sleepless nights, and the answer had not changed. I want the hillside, outright, in my name, and I want a controlling share in whatever the vineyard becomes going forward. In exchange, I'll grant the easement. She looked at her brother. That's not a threat. That's the only offer that gets you a sale at all. He set the certificate down as though it had grown heavier in his hand, and outside, faint through the cottage window, Rosalind lifted her head from the grass and watched the house the way she had once watched the collapsed well, waiting, patient, for whatever came next. Her brother did not answer at once. He turned the certificate over in his hands, as though the reverse side might offer some clause he had missed, some loophole that would return him to the man who had sat in a lawyer's office 8 months earlier and pronounced a hillside worthless. There was no such clause. There never had been. You understand what you're asking, he said finally. You'd own more of this place than either of us. I've owned more of this place than either of you for 10 years, she said. I'm only asking the paper to agree with the dirt. It was not said with heat. That was the thing her sister would remember later, and mention once, quietly, to a friend in Los Angeles who had never understood any of it, that there had been no triumph in her voice, no relish, only the flatness of a woman reading numbers off a ledger she had already reconciled a dozen times in her head. Her brother looked toward the window, toward the shape of the horse in the low autumn light, and something in his face loosened, not into warmth exactly, but into the particular exhaustion of a man who has run out of leverage and is only now discovering how little he had needed it in the first place. Draft it, he said. Send it to our lawyer. I won't fight you on the numbers. Her sister said nothing for a long moment, and when she spoke, it was not to Isabel, but to the table between them. He'd have wanted this, wouldn't he? All of it going to you. It was the closest thing to an apology either of them would offer, and Isabel did not correct her, did not remind her that wanting had never been in question, only whether anyone besides an old man in a rocking chair had been paying attention. She let the silence stand in for the years it could not undo. The papers took 3 weeks to draft and 1 afternoon to sign, in the same office with the same brass lamp and the same smell of lemon oil on old wood, though this time no one raised a hand in a vote, because there was nothing left to vote on. The lawyer read the terms aloud, in the same measured voice he had used to read the will, and when he reached the clause naming Isabel as majority holder of record, he paused just long enough to look up at her over his glasses, the way a man looks at a hand he has finally seen played out in full. Outside, the light had already begun to turn toward spring, thin and clean over the hills, and Rosalind stood at the fence line waiting, as she always did, for Isabel to come home. By April, the hillside had shed its winter mud and hardened into something plantable, and she chose a Saturday morning for it, the kind with fog still pooled in the low draws and the sun only beginning to work it loose. She had kept the old mission cuttings wrapped in damp burlap since February, the way he had taught her, and now she carried them up the terraces in a canvas sack slung across one shoulder, a mattock in the other hand, Rosalind trailing behind without a lead rope because there was no longer any need for one. The rows he had marked in his own hand, decades before, were still visible if you knew where to look, faint depressions in the rock-scarred earth, stones cleared and piled at the edges by hands that had been dead 11 years before she ever picked up the work herself. She set the first cutting into the ground where his mark told her to, tamped the soil with the flat of her palm, and did not stand until she had done the same for the second and the third, working her way down the terrace in the unhurried rhythm that had once made her siblings roll their eyes and now made the wine conglomerate's engineers nod with something close to respect. Rosalind grazed along the fence line, unbothered, lifting her head now and then to watch. When the sack was empty, Isabel sat back on her heels and drew the folded note from her coat pocket. The paper had softened at its creases from 100 years of dark and a season of her own reading, but the ink held, the same slanting hand that had signed 100 harvest tallies. You were the one who stayed when staying cost you something. She read aloud, to no one but the horse and the hillside. Your brother wanted the money, your sister wanted the name, you wanted the land to still be standing come spring. That is the only kind of wanting I ever trusted. She folded it again, carefully, along the same lines, and slid it back into her coat. The spring wind moved through the young canes she'd just set, barely more than sticks in the soil, though in 4 years they would bear fruit, and in 10 they would be exactly what he had always sworn they would be, the only rootstock on the whole hillside worth the trouble of saving. She did not know yet what the wine would taste like. She only knew that she would be the one to find out, standing here every spring after this one, with the horse at the fence and the water running clean and legal beneath the rock where it had always belonged to her family, waiting, like everything else on this hill, for someone patient enough to notice.